Among the things that differentiate and elevate Fallout New Vegas above most role-playing games, there is the way the developers at Obsidian Entertainment use all of the main factions of the game to explore many different types of societies born out of the different ideologies followed by these factions. None of them are idealized in such a way that they lack flaws and don't commit mistakes. The ideals each faction aspires to regarding the society they find themselves in the process of building are always presented to later contrast with how said aspiration and ideals are put into practice and the inevitable compromises that come after they clash with the unpredictability of the post-apocalyptic wasteland. The New California Republic is, or rather was, due to what happened to it after the events of New Vegas, a well-established nation with a century of history in the course of which they developed their own identity and culture, although drawing heavily from the old United States in their mission to rebuild civilization by reinstating the institutions and values of pre-war American society. Mr. House is a pre-war magnate that convinced a few of the Las Vegas tribes to adopt new customs based around different archetypes from before the war, to use them as managers for the casinos that finance his vision for the future of the wasteland, giving the city of New Vegas a considerable economic power, even if House only sees its inhabitants as tools to grow the economy. Both factions are presented with functioning and sustainable societies. The old tribes of Las Vegas under Mr. House mostly preserve the same structure, hierarchy, and family ties from their tribal societies in the process of becoming the three families, but now with the extra of New Vegas's economy. Meanwhile, the NCR had a population counting in the hundreds of thousands that kept the nation afloat through agriculture, cattle raising, industry, education, besides having a shared identity they saw themselves as a part of. All things these two factions don't have in common with Caesar's Legion, because it doesn't really have an entirely functional society capable of sustaining itself. The Legion is an army of slaves that forcibly destroys families and erases any cultural identity a person might have to assimilate them into a homogeneous army that foments blind loyalty exclusively to their leader, Caesar. The Legion exists and was created with the only purpose of accomplishing his ambitions of conquest. Fallout New Vegas established they control Arizona, New Mexico, most of Colorado, and parts of Utah, but this vast amount of territory doesn't mean much as they are closer to something like territory under military occupation. Legionaries don't work the land to produce food nor the materials to make their equipment. That's the job of slaves, most of them women, not considered by the Legion capable of being soldiers, or the non-tribal people that already lived in those territories that either pay tribute to the Legion in the form of supplies and equipment or sell it to them in the case of merchants. In exchange, the Legion protects them from raiders and ensures the safety of caravans, specifically on the trade routes that cross the land under their control. Despite enjoying these benefits, the inhabitants that live in these territories don't really see themselves as part of the Legion, and the Legion only considers them to be under its protection as it doesn't have any citizens nor a shared identity that could include and unify a civilian population. The Legion only either has subjects that pay tribute to it or slaves with an assigned role forced or coerced to serve Caesar with various degrees of freedom. The inhabitants of the Legion's territories might not be slaves, like everyone that is part of the Legion, but they are not entirely free either. Life under the Legion can be quiet and even prosperous for those who know how to keep their mouth shut. The Legion guarantees safety and ease of trade, and that's something most of the wasteland lacks, although there is always an uncertainty when being close to legionaries because one slip can cost someone their life. The military hierarchy of the Legion gives no room to consider the well-being or rights of people. It strictly demands that everyone indiscriminately follows every order, and even though the Legion doesn't have any laws in a traditional sense, it has arbitrary rules imposed by Caesar that call for brutal punishments for every offense. From things that one would expect like theft or trafficking of chems to the death penalty for any disobedience or for simply mentioning the name of a certain person that Caesar doesn't like to be reminded of. Being an army, the Legion solves its problems with violence, and lacking a civilian society to back it, this army works as a horde that wanders around the wasteland, taking by force wherever it needs, enslaving people to sustain itself, and to replenish and expand its military capacity in an endless campaign to just keep existing. The Legion needs wars and to be constantly fighting an enemy after another because it needs slaves to train into new soldiers to replace the fallen ones. It needs slaves to keep afloat an economy and produce supplies for the army, and above all, it needs slaves to fulfill the purpose for which Caesar formed the Legion. All of its efforts are directed towards making war against everyone that Caesar sees as an inferior, seeking to break their societies, eradicate their cultures, and enslave and integrate their people to the war machine so they can later do the same to the next group Caesar points to. Once a part of the Legion, the concept of family is erased. Each one is separated, with everyone being assigned different roles that tend to be legionary for men, trained to be a legionary for boys, and for women either manual labor or reproduction. The conquered cultures, along with their practices and technologies that they could have developed, are brutally suppressed unless one of said practices or technologies is recognized to have practical value that could be repurposed for war, in which case that single thing is preserved while still erasing the rest of the culture that created it. Healing powder being a good example, a mixture of dried herbs created by a now assimilated tribe that proved to be a decent replacement for more advanced forms of medicine that the Legion rejects, as well as other advanced technologies. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This is what Caesar believes in and serves as the cornerstone upon which he built his ideology and the one of his legion. In his declared thesis and place of birth, the new California Republic, he sees a decadent society not fit for the realities of the wasteland that succumbed to the same type of corruption that consumed the pre-war United States, a nation with a government that incentivizes individual benefit to such extreme as to create systematic and cultural problems of corruption and greed to the detriment of the most vulnerable. Caesar, having been born and raised in the NCR, sees himself and by extension the Legion as its antithesis, what he believes the wasteland needs, a tool to homogenize the countless tribes that regress to the Stone Age and the many different communities that form in the centuries since the Great War, getting rid of their perceived primitive behaviors, corruption and tribalism, and reforming them to both be better adapted to life in the wasteland and to avoid falling into the same vices shared by the NCR and pre-war America. And so Caesar believes he is paving the road to eventually restore the prosperity once enjoyed by humanity through the clash between his legion and the new California Republic. Thesis and antithesis that, according to him, will result in the synthesis of both to create a stronger society that will be capable of moving forward, benefiting all of the people in the wasteland. Frankly, I barely know anything about philosophy, so I don't feel comfortable enough talking and trying to analyze Caesar's interpretation of Hegelian dialectics. So I'm just going to point to a few of the times Caesar has been very loose with his ideology when putting it into practice. The first time the Legion faced an enemy capable of defeating it was the NCR during the Battle of Hoover Dam, which resulted in a devastating defeat for the Legion. The maneuver that won the battle for the Republic was the positioning of snipers in high ground to eliminate the officers leading the assault of the Legion and then lure their veterans into a trap when they tried to chase, which caused panic that the NCR infantry was able to capitalize on. The Legion prioritizes melee weapons and physical training. They use firearms, but it is in a limited manner in specific roles such as raiding parties. This comes from the rejection of advanced technology encouraged by Caesar and justified by the belief that it creates a dependency that makes people weak. But at the same time, Caesar's philosophy would have been make the Legion adopt the wide-scale use of firearms after such a devastating defeat at the hands of an enemy who did effectively use their firepower. but instead he blamed and tried to execute the legate in charge of the battle, using him as a scapegoat for the failure, and when Caesar learned that he had survived, he forbade any mention of the legate's name. Another example of the conflict between the rejection of technology and Caesar's philosophy can be seen in the use of medicine in the legion. Stimpaks, medics, or any form of modern medical practices that could save legionaries from completely avoidable deaths are frowned upon or strictly forbidden by Caesar. But not for Caesar. In his tent, another dog can be found, one of the most advanced pieces of medical technology that the pre-war United States could produce, and capable of treating a plethora of different afflictions, something Caesar and his close circle made use of before it broke. And when the machine broke, he lost the only way to treat his brain tumor, and due to the rejection towards medicine and advanced technology he fomented, no one among his thousands of legionaries and slaves has the knowledge and tools to help. Despite the clear detriment it means for the lives of everyone in the legion, including his own, Caesar imposes this rejection of technology, medicine, and knowledge in general because it could present a threat to his position that the average legionary could have some education and skills that could give a certain degree of autonomy, enough to see the contradictions of their leader. Caesar is in the position he's in thanks to the education he received while being a part of the followers of the apocalypse, and that later twisted to convince an isolated tribe in the middle of the Grand Canyon to follow him in endless military campaigns to conquer one tribe after another, using what he learned to make them believe he's the son of the Roman god of war, Mars, and to teach them combat tactics and a few phrases in Latin, but little more than that. Caesar has shown no interest in turning the legion into a functional society that could achieve progress on its own while being self-sustainable. It only exists to be an army of conquest that will blindly and without question follow the will of Caesar in his search for more power. By making its main method of survival be the enslavement of entire tribes to do all the work in an unsustainable cycle long term, by fomenting the rejection of knowledge and beneficial technologies to make sure no one questions or threatens his position, by demanding loyalty exclusively to him and destroying any sense of identity or ties that could unite his subordinates beyond that loyalty, in the Legion Caesar created something that offers no future because it has no clear future. Caesar centralized so much in himself that he is what keeps the legion together. The legionaries believe he's the son of a god, but they don't share his ideals, nor they have a strong tie to the legion because it was never a society that encouraged the formation of bonds that would give way to a collective identity. And all of this goes without mentioning how the less privileged slaves that have to do everything except the fighting feel about the legion. Being his fate almost guaranteed due to the brain tumor, a legion without Caesar would probably quickly collapse.